I won't allow a man like you to date my daughter. A part-time high school student? Are you serious? I've had enough of hearing about your struggles growing up in a single-parent household. Why don't you just leave? You're nothing but an eyesore. The man across from me suddenly stood, grabbed his cup, and threw the lukewarm contents at me. It wasn't hot enough to burn, but it shattered the last bit of pride I had left. Words of apology were trapped inside me, never spoken. Instead, I pushed myself up and staggered out of the room. She didn't come after me. Bitterness settled in, and I channeled all my energy into working harder. Years passed, and when I crossed paths with that man again, now my father-in-law, an attorney, I never could have predicted how things would unfold. This is the story of my life's turnaround. My name is Nathan, and I'm a clerk at a law firm. My journey to this point wasn't straightforward. I graduated from a part-time high school and was fortunate enough to land this job because of some personal connections. The boss knew about my situation. I had been working part-time at the firm since high school. Despite having just a high school diploma and no particular skills, the boss took a chance on me, and I'll always be grateful for that. I'm learning a lot here, and every day I strive to gain more knowledge so I can be of greater help. I grew up in a single-parent household with a younger brother and sister. I barely remember my father. He was a violent man when he drank, and he was almost never home. My siblings probably have the same vague memories of him. One night, when he went on a rampage, we fled the house, fearing for our lives. That's when my mother, siblings, and I began our new life in a tiny apartment. Looking back, that's likely when my parents divorced, though no one ever told us. We moved far from our old home, taking several trains to a place where the climate was mild, and the winters were gentle. It suited my mother's frail health, which often left her bedridden. After middle school, I enrolled in a part-time high school, working multiple jobs to help support the family. I did everything from stocking shelves at convenience stores to pumping gas and even some manual labor at construction sites. Whenever I heard about a job, I grabbed it. One of those jobs was at this very law firm. The work was basic: stamping mail, organizing documents, and sorting printed materials. But the pay was decent, and my colleagues were kind. I enjoyed it and put in as many hours as I could. When I finally graduated, I was hired as a full-time clerk. It was a blessing I'll never forget. Another job that left an impression on me was at a small tea room. The place was owned by a friend's uncle and was known for its wide selection of teas, attracting a loyal group of locals. The owner's wife baked delicious homemade treats, and her cookies were a favorite of my younger siblings. It was at this tea room that I met Claire. She was about my age, with petite features and long black hair that she always wore tied back. Her calm voice and gentle smile were incredibly charming, and she was deeply passionate about tea. We bonded quickly, and before long, we were dating. It was our first relationship, and everything felt so new. Our first dates, our first time holding hands. Slowly, our connection deepened. By the time I graduated high school and began working at the law firm, Claire continued at the tea room while attending a local college. Every day after work, I would visit her, and she would greet me with a fresh cup of tea. It became our little ritual, and afterward, I'd walk her to the train station. After 4 years together, I proposed. My younger siblings were in high school. My mom had found steady work, and our home life was finally stable. The future seemed bright. When Claire said yes, I was overwhelmed with joy and even cried. Everything felt almost too good to be true. But soon enough, our happiness faced its first real test. Claire came from a family with deep roots. Politicians and lawyers ran in her bloodline. Her grandfather had been a city councilman, and her father was a successful lawyer. She was an only child, doted on by her parents. When I found out about her family's wealth and prestige, I was stunned. But she laughed it off, saying it didn't matter. My folks are overprotective, sure, but they trust my choices, she assured me. She mentioned me often to them, and she told me not to worry, that they always smiled when they heard about me. Despite her reassurances, I couldn't help but feel nervous when the time came to meet her parents. Their house was enormous, a traditional home surrounded by a tall fence in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I had always dropped her off at the train station, so I had never seen it before. Claire always declined my offers to drive her home, saying a car was already coming to pick her up. Seeing her grand home now made me feel even smaller in comparison to the cramped apartment I shared with my family. "It's old and kind of embarrassing," Claire said, leading me through the gate, but all I could do was shake my head in disbelief. We were greeted by her mother, who had the same gentle smile and warmth as Claire. The resemblance was striking. "Nathan, nice to meet you," I said, bowing politely as I introduced myself. Her mother smiled softly and welcomed me in. "My husband's running a little late. I hope you don't mind waiting," she said. "Not at all," I replied, as she led us to a living room decorated with beautiful American artwork and expensive-looking vases. The tea she served was delicate, and the atmosphere was calm, much like Claire's personality. Without warning, the sliding door opened, and a stern-looking man entered. He said nothing as he sat down next to Claire's mother. From the way she served him without any introduction, I knew instantly that this was her father. Hello, my name is Nathan," I said, straightening my back and bowing deeply. His response was a cold glance, and not a single word left his lips. I stood there, confused, glancing at Claire, who seemed just as lost. Her eyes darted between her father and me, clearly unsettled by the tense silence. It was Claire's mother who finally broke the ice. "Nathan, please, you can look up now," she said gently, then turned to her husband. "Honey, what's the matter?" She lifted a hand, trying to defuse the situation, but her husband cut her off, his voice sharp. "So, Nathan, is it? Claire mentioned she wanted us to meet." "Well, I did some digging," he said. My heart skipped a beat. What does he mean by digging? I haven't done anything wrong, and the idea of being involved in something illegal is ridiculous. As I processed his words, he let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "I've heard your family's poor," he stated bluntly. "You've been working part-time jobs to help with the bills." Hearing it said so plainly, I felt a sting of embarrassment. Sure, we didn't have much, but I'd always considered our life typical. I guess from the perspective of someone from a wealthy, influential family, my situation must have seemed inferior. He wasn't finished. "I want Claire to have more than just an average life. That's what any parent wants for their child. But someone as broke as you? Out of the question." The maliciousness in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, struggling to process his outright rejection. His lips curled into a smirk as if he was savoring my discomfort. "You didn't even go to college. You graduated from a night school, didn't you? What kind of career could you possibly have? What kind of future can you offer, Claire? You'll never be anything like me, a lawyer. You're not even close to being the kind of man I want for my daughter," he added, his tone dripping with condescension. Claire, sitting beside me, looked utterly stunned. It was as though she was grappling with the weight of her father's words, unsure of how to respond. I couldn't even look up, the humiliation weighing heavily on my shoulders. "I won't allow my daughter to marry someone as uneducated as you, a man with just a night school diploma," he sneered, his voice rising with anger. "I've heard enough of your sad little stories about growing up in a single-parent household. Why don't you just leave? You're nothing but an eyesore." He stood abruptly, grabbing his teacup in a fit of rage. Before I knew it, lukewarm tea splashed across my chest. It didn't burn, but the humiliation of it was worse than any physical pain. My pride, already fragile, shattered into pieces. "I'm sorry," I muttered, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. My legs trembled as I stood, barely managing to get myself out of the room. Claire didn't follow me. That night, I received a message from Claire. She apologized profusely and said she wanted to meet and talk, but I couldn't bring myself to see her again. After being torn down like that, how could I face her? My self-worth had been crushed, and I felt like any further conversation would only make me feel even smaller. Marriage seemed impossible. In the end, we decided to go our separate ways. 10 years passed. I'm 32 now, still working at the same law firm. I've earned my national certification, and the constant workload has helped me bury the pain of the past. I haven't spoken to Claire since that day. From what I've heard, she got a job, moved out of her parents' house, and was transferred out of state after her 3rd year. I never replied to her messages, but even after all these years, I haven't been able to forget her. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to love someone again. To drown out these lingering thoughts, I throw myself deeper into my work. "Nathan, are you heading to the courthouse? Could you drop off these documents for me?" A senior lawyer called out to me as I was getting ready to leave. Today I was scheduled to accompany the director to the courthouse, and since the request was simple enough, I nodded and took the car keys. The director had been like a father to me since my high school days. He'd taken me under his wing when I was just a part-time worker, and despite my efforts, I could never outshine him. He was always so pleasant, so easygoing, but from what I'd heard from my senior colleagues, in his younger days, he'd been known as Demon Nash. After 10 years at the firm, I was still at the bottom of the hierarchy, often playing the role of secretary whenever the director went out. When we arrived at the local courthouse, I parted ways with him to deliver some documents a colleague had entrusted to me. They were probably for the next trial, given the rush. They might have even been due today. After dropping them off, I headed toward the restroom when I spotted a familiar face. For a moment, I thought I must be mistaken, but it was a face I could never forget. Walking straight toward me, with an air of authority, was Claire's father. I kept my head down, hoping he wouldn't recognize me. I nodded in his direction, trying to avoid eye contact, but he stopped directly in my path. Well, well, isn't this the overconfident young man who had the nerve to propose to my daughter without a college degree? He said, a mocking edge to his voice. I had hoped he wouldn't remember me, but clearly I was wrong. I stood silently, eyes cast down. What are you doing here? Being sued, perhaps? Do you need my help? Someone like you, uneducated and clueless about the law, must be in over their head, he sneered. Suddenly his expression changed, and fury flashed in his eyes. It sent a shiver down my spine. You must have said something to Claire. Ever since that day, she stopped listening to me. She used to be such a good, obedient girl, but now she's acting out like she's under some kind of bad influence. I don't know what you're talking about, I said firmly, lifting my head slightly. I haven't spoken to Claire since that day. Your accusations don't make any sense to me. Oh, really? You think you can just brush me off like that? Claire's father sneered, his eyes narrowing. People like you aren't even capable of holding a conversation with someone like Claire or me. Know your place, stay in it, and never show your face around me again. That might be a bit hard for you to manage, came a calm voice from behind. Director Fletcher appeared, his presence instantly shifting the mood. Oh, Mr. Fletcher! Why are you here? Claire's father stammered, visibly startled. I watched as he awkwardly bent forward in a deep bow, his surprise evident. He clearly recognized Fletcher as his superior. This is a courthouse, isn't it? Fletcher chuckled. Where else would attorneys like us be? His tone was light, but the subtle edge was unmistakable. Claire's father could only look on in stunned silence. Come on now, Fletcher continued, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Weren't you president of the Bar Association once? You're a big name in the legal world, aren't you? Well, yes, I suppose so, Claire's father mumbled, unable to maintain eye contact. Being an attorney, it's natural to be in courtrooms, Fletcher said, still grinning before turning to me. More importantly, what's going on with our Nathan here? He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I knew that look in his eyes well. It was the same one I'd seen many times before when he was angry, despite the smile on his face. Nathan is my protege, Fletcher announced, his voice now carrying weight. He's one of the best lawyers I've trained. A lawyer? Claire's father shot me a bewildered glance. But didn't you just graduate from a night high school? I nodded calmly. That was true 10 years ago, I said. But thanks to Director Fletcher's mentorship, I became a lawyer. You don't need a college degree to pass the bar. I managed to get through the exams, and I've been practicing for the past 5 years. I could see the disbelief in Claire's father's eyes as he processed my words. The lawyer's badge on my suit, which he had clearly overlooked, now seemed to burn into his vision. After we broke up, I had hit rock bottom. Director Fletcher had noticed my struggles and encouraged me to study law. He explained that a college degree wasn't a requirement, just a dedication and hard work. I threw myself into it, and after rigorous preparation, I passed the exams on my first attempt. It hadn't been easy, but with Fletcher's guidance, I succeeded. My colleagues celebrated with me when I earned my lawyer's badge. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. Nathan has always been exceptional, Fletcher said with pride. He passed everything on his first try. Since high school, he's worked hard alongside our senior staff, always hands-on and proactive. I'm grooming him to be my successor. Hearing those words, I felt a deep blush rise to my cheeks. Meanwhile, Claire's father stood frozen, unable to hide his shock. Oh, and as it happens, Nathan will be the lead attorney for the plaintiff in the upcoming case, Fletcher said, his smile growing slyer. I believe you're representing the defendant, aren't you? Should be an interesting matchup, don't you think? Fletcher's subtle taunt left me smiling too. I'd learned from the best, and now I was ready to prove myself. Claire's father, on the other hand, had gone pale, his composure slipping. Even his boss, who had been quietly standing by, was trembling. "Well, see you in court," Fletcher added before we turned and walked away. What followed was a whirlwind of trial preparations. The case was a divorce battle, one that had escalated after mediation attempts failed. Our client, the wife, was resolute in seeking both a divorce and alimony, backed by substantial evidence of infidelity and domestic abuse. The details in the medical report were harrowing, strengthening my resolve to win the case. On the day of the trial, I reassured our anxious client, "You're not alone in this. We're all behind you, just like your kids, your parents, and your friends. We'll give it our best shot together." She nodded, and we entered the courtroom. The trial was an overwhelming victory for us. The husband's defense was weak, disjointed, and insincere. We secured the alimony, $30,000, along with full custody for the wife, child support of $1,000 a month, and a lump sum payment that would continue until the child reached adulthood. Everything had gone as we'd hoped. As the verdict was announced, the defendant slumped in his seat, utterly defeated. I noticed Claire's father lean toward him, possibly suggesting an appeal, but it was clear the husband couldn't bear any further humiliation. The case concluded right there. As we were leaving the courthouse, I heard a familiar voice call out sharply. I knew instantly who it was. No one else could speak with such arrogance. Sure enough, it was Claire's father, standing a short distance away, glaring at me with disdain. "Don't get cocky," he growled. "So what if you're a lawyer without a proper education? You're never going to make it big. I won't have someone like you, without a degree, acting all high and mighty. I might not have the education you're so proud of, but that's never been my goal," I replied calmly. "I became a lawyer to help those who need it most. Climbing the corporate ladder isn't what matters to me. I can't stand by while people abuse their power, and I won't let anyone trample over the vulnerable." "Humph," he scoffed, "young and naive. That's just idealistic nonsense." "Maybe so," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "but it's something I believe a lawyer should never forget." "You insolent man! I can't stand dealing with someone like you," Claire's father snapped before storming off, defeated and humiliated. The blow to his pride must have been immense after looking down on me for so long. Watching him retreat, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication for the choices I'd made. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Claire walked into the office. "Claire?" I muttered in surprise. It had been so long, but she still looked as beautiful as ever, though I noticed a weariness in her eyes. She had come to discuss something concerning her parents, as one of the clerks informed me, after overhearing their conversation. "Something about her parents?" I asked, and Claire, with tearful eyes, pulled out a stack of photographs. I looked down at them and saw her father in various intimate moments with a woman who was clearly not her mother. The images were taken in different settings, with different outfits, leaving little doubt about the infidelity they captured. "My dad used to smother me and my mom, treating us like birds trapped in a cage," Claire explained, her voice trembling. "I didn't realize anything was wrong until about 10 years ago. I thought it was normal, but something happened, and I left home. Since then, it's gotten worse for my mom. She hardly ever leaves the house, and he just berates her constantly. She used to love going out, but now she's afraid to upset him. Can't we get them divorced? I'm scared for her. If we don't do something, she'll break." As she said this, Claire's voice cracked, and she began to sob into her handkerchief. "I'm sorry, Claire," the clerk said softly, "but without your mother's direct involvement—" "Please," Claire pleaded, bowing her head repeatedly. "Isn't there anything we can do? In divorce cases, the person's intention is everything, and there's little room for family intervention. Yet, seeing Claire so desperate stirred something in me. It wasn't just about helping her, it was my duty as an attorney. "Can we speak to your mother directly?" I asked, and Claire immediately looked up, her eyes red and puffy. She fumbled with her phone and quickly dialed her mother. "She's available now," Claire said, putting the call on speaker. Her mother's voice came through the phone, but it sounded nothing like the woman I remembered. It was hollow, drained of all vitality. "A divorce? I haven't thought about that," her mother said weakly. "Thank you for your concern, but—" "Mom," Claire interrupted, her voice growing frantic. "This isn't love. You know that, right? He's controlling you. You protected me from him all those years ago. You held him back when I left. Now it's my turn. I'll protect you, but please, let's leave together." On the other end, all I could hear were her mother's soft sobs. "I'm Nathan. I spoke up gently. Divorces are always difficult, and I can't recommend one lightly. But if your husband were willing to change— He's not going to change, Claire cut in sharply. I agree, I said. A person like that is unlikely to change after so many years. But if you want to escape this life, that's a different story. And if you're too afraid to stand up to him, let me do it for you. That's what lawyers are for. There was a pause before Claire's mother whispered, "Thank you." With that, we had our answer. I immediately arranged for Claire and her mother to leave town and stay in a hotel out of state to ensure their safety. We had no idea what kind of backlash we might face, and I wasn't taking any chances. I sent a certified letter to Claire's father, initiating divorce negotiations. Along with the letter, I included the incriminating photographs Claire had provided. The response was swift. Claire's father called, his voice seething with rage. "What is the meaning of this? Is this some kind of twisted revenge? Where are they? What have you done?" "This isn't about revenge," I replied calmly. "I'm acting on behalf of your wife. Your daughter gathered the evidence, and they both don't wish to see you again. I'm simply facilitating their request." "This is a marital issue," he growled. "We'll settle it between us." "You know that's not possible," I said. "You're a lawyer, you should know better." "Then we'll settle it in court," he threatened. "That's your choice," I said coolly. "But think about what will happen if this goes public. You're a well-respected lawyer, aren't you? What do you think will happen when your affair and domestic abuse become common knowledge? We have the evidence, and it won't end well for you." There was a long pause. When I asked again, "Do you really want to take this to court?" the response was a begrudging, "Understood." From that point forward, our demands were met with almost no resistance. Claire's parents divorced quietly. While the affair didn't make headlines, it wasn't long before rumors started circulating. Eventually, a weekly magazine published an exposé, tarnishing Claire's father's reputation. He was dismissed from the firm he once worked for and struggled to start his own practice. In a profession that thrives on trust, his downfall was inevitable. After all the chaos settled, Claire and I reconnected. She apologized sincerely for the past, and we decided to rebuild our relationship, starting with friendship. Her warmth and resilience drew me in once again, and before long, I asked her out. A year later, we found ourselves staring at a piece of paper together. "This is the most nervous I've ever been," I admitted, my hands trembling slightly. "It's fine," Claire said with a smile. "I got 3 copies just in case." I laughed, glancing down at the marriage registration form on the table. After everything we had been through, we were finally making it official. I hadn't been able to forget Claire in the decade we were apart, and apparently she had felt the same. We decided not to wait any longer. For witnesses, we chose the owner of the cafe where we had first met and, of course, Director Fletcher. "Once this is submitted," Claire said softly, "we'll officially be a family." "Are you sure you're okay with living with my mom?" she asked. We had decided that Claire's mother would live with us. She had been recovering well, but there were still moments when she was fragile, and we didn't want to leave her alone. "She's your mother," I said, squeezing Claire's hand. "That makes her family to me, too." Claire smiled, reassured. "Thanks. My family is doing well on their own anyway. My mom is thriving, traveling solo, and even joining a local choir." I looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, cloudless day, the perfect day to submit our marriage papers. A sense of peace settled over me, a feeling of contentment I hadn't known in years. "I'm so happy," I whispered, unable to contain the warmth spreading through my chest. There had been so many difficult years when happiness felt out of reach, but now, with Claire by my side and everyone around me thriving, those dark days felt like a distant memory. Back then, when Claire's father had humiliated me, throwing tea in my face, I had felt nothing but despair and shame. But now, in hindsight, I realized that experience had shaped me into who I was today. If it hadn't been for that moment, I might never have pursued law. I might never have worked as hard as I did. And for that, in a strange way, I was grateful. Yet, I could never fully forgive him for the pain he caused. "You can't always say hard work pays off," I said, turning to Claire, "but I can honestly say I'm glad I pushed myself back then. It led me here." Beside me, Claire laughed, her joy infectious. I smiled back at her and squeezed her hand a little tighter.